Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, is more than an educational program. It's a call to action to improve the future of every Jewish institution. Our classes meet the moment with supportive learning that helps navigate an evolving and challenging Jewish community landscape. Bring these invaluable skills, tools, and resources to your organization. Applications are accepted on a rolling basis. Apply by January 12th to get in on spring classes before they begin. Just head to usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 402, In the Wilderness. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're speaking about a somewhat heavy topic, youth mental health and the mental health crisis facing our youth, but also a very optimistic topic because our guest today, Jory Hanselman Mayschak, is the founder and CEO of an organization called Bamidbar, which is dedicated to youth mental health in the Jewish community. In fact, it's the nation's first Jewish wilderness therapy program. A little bit more about Bamidbar. Bamidbar's mission is to ensure that Jewish youth and young adults have the confidence, skills, and community support to navigate life's challenges and thrive in the face of adversity. Bamidbar envisions a Jewish community that actively supports young people in cultivating mental health and wellness and strengthens young people's mental health by using a layered approach that focuses both on the individual young person and the ecosystem that surrounds them. Bamidbar addresses the youth mental health crisis through clinical therapy and educational interventions. Before we introduce our guest, a few words about an amazing upcoming experience that's part of the Yeshiva. It's not our typical 3-week course. It's not our typical 12-week course. It's actually a 6-week experience, and it's not really a course. We're not calling it a course. It's more of an uncourse, really. It's called Dungeons and Dragons and Dreidels, exploring big Jewish questions through role-playing. The experience is going to be taught or led by the wonderful Sean Harris, who was our guest on episode 338 of Judaism Unbound, and you can learn more about the class and sign up by heading to judaismunbound.com/classes. Now, I want to remind folks that there is financial aid available for Judaism Unbound classes. So if you go over there and you really want to participate in this experience, but the price feels out of reach for you, there is a form you can fill out to get financial aid for the experience. And we're really excited for anybody who loves role-playing games and who wants to connect that to Judaism. We're really excited for you to be part of that. So please avail yourself of all the opportunities there if you need them. So whether you're a person who's loved role-playing for years, or you've heard about D&D, but you've never really given it a try, that would be me, this is a great chance to dive into an outside-the-box and creative kind of Jewish learning. So again, just head over to judaismunbound.com/classes to sign up. Now to introduce our guest today. Jory Hanselman Mayschak is the founder and CEO of Bamidbar. She started her career in the world of Jewish camping when she joined the Ramah in the Rockies team during its inaugural season. Since that time, Jory Hanselman Mayschak has worked in a variety of wilderness therapy and experiential programs, and in 2016, she returned to Ramah in the Rockies to develop and launch Bamidbar as the nation's first Jewish wilderness therapy program. Jory Hanselman Mayschak has a master's degree in nonprofit leadership from the University of Colorado and a certificate in innovation and entrepreneurship from Stanford University. She is an alum of the Wexner Field Fellowship and in 2023 received the very prestigious Pomegranate Prize from the Covenant Foundation, which recognizes exciting up-and-coming Jewish educators. So, Jory Hanselman Mayschak, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Dan and Lex, it's so great to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
So could we start off by your just sort of telling us the story of the founding of Bamidbar? Like, how did we go from a world without Bamidbar to a world with Bamidbar?
Bamidbar is an organization dedicated to supporting youth and young adult mental health in the Jewish community. And we actually started as a program of Ramah in the Rockies, which is a Jewish outdoor adventure summer camp. And Ramah in the Rockies executive director, when he was hiring outdoor Jewish professionals, realized a lot of those individuals had been to or worked at wilderness therapy programs. and started to ask, like, what is this thing, wilderness therapy, this use of outdoor experiences to support a mental health journey? Why are there so many young Jews that I'm seeing in this environment who have experience in that space? Are there options within the Jewish community to support that? If someone keeps kosher or keeps Shabbat, if is kind of traditionally observant, can those needs be met? And if not, why not? And so that started the conversation of Bamidbar. And at the same time, the local community around Raman the Rockies had a number of young people who were struggling with mental health. And their parents and caregivers were reaching out to the Jewish community for resources and realizing that there was nothing there. And were really outraged and felt that they were kind of being left behind. And so that started Bamidbar as the nation's first Jewish wilderness therapy program. So using wilderness and outdoor-based experiences as a vehicle for therapeutic growth for young adults who are struggling with mental health challenges.
So who is the person who goes to wilderness therapy versus other kinds of therapy? Like, what's it all about? What happens there? And then what's the Jewish layering onto it? Like, I imagine wilderness therapy is something that exists outside the Jewish world. So how does the Jewish wilderness therapy supplement the idea of wilderness therapy? And by the way, as I'm saying this, I'm like thinking and obviously this is where the name comes from, but I'm thinking about the whole Torah and thinking like the whole thing takes place in the wilderness. Anyway, so what's that about?
So in 2018, Bamidbar launched the nation's first Jewish wilderness therapy program, supporting Jewish young adults who are struggling with depression, anxiety, co-occurring substance use, different mental health challenges. We pretty quickly realized we were having a deep impact on a small number of individuals through our residential treatment program, but the need in the Jewish community around mental health is vast, and there's so much opportunity to connect mental health conversations to Jewish tradition and Jewish wisdom. And so we in 2019 stepped back and said, how do we take what we're learning in this environment and serve the broader community? We planned in 2020 to roll out some new programming. In March 2020, we ran a 5-day retreat for 22 Jewish professionals at the Raman the Rockies Ranch, and then the whole world shut down. And we realized we had all of this content focused on helping youth serving educators to better support mental health needs of teens and young adults, and that Jewish professionals needed that really desperately at that time. So we took all of that content and began to work with Jewish professionals to support them in better meeting those mental health needs of youth in the community. In 2021, we went back to in-person therapeutic programming and realized that that clinical and educational side of our work were feeling siloed. And so we transitioned to a community-based model in 2023, just now, bridging the gap between young people who are struggling and their ecosystem of support.
So I actually am not sure whether or not we said Bamidbar means in the wilderness. You were talking about Bamidbar, the organization, and then talking about wilderness therapy. It means in the wilderness, and it's also the fourth book in the Torah that we usually translate numbers because that's what it is in Greek, arithmoi. That was the first choice for what to call that book. But Bamidbar is a really interesting word, and I want to look at a few different ways we could understand it and then sort of pass it back to you, because I think all of them relate to mental health in different ways. So in the wilderness, I think, is one of the more common translations of it. That sense of being in a wilderness, being surrounded by uncertainty, really comes through in that book, and it's also something that many of us wrestle with in terms of our own psychological health, our own mental health. I also want to name that sometimes when people talk about that part of the Torah, they talk about not so much being in a wilderness, but being in specifically a desert, because that's like the particular land that they're passing through, they being like the Israelites going from Egypt to eventually Canaan. And I think that's interesting because the desert is not a word we usually associate with like overwhelm and a sea of uncertainty. It's more a word of like isolation. If you're like picturing someone in a desert, we even talk about like desert islands as isolation. Those are two ways we could understand Bamidbar. And I'm curious how that relates to the day by day, week by week work that you actually do with people. On the one hand, is your work about confronting people's sense of isolation in that desert sense? I know with COVID, that came up so much for so many of us. On the other, and maybe it's not two different hands, maybe it's one clasped hand together, I don't know. On the other, in what ways is this about confronting and working with people to overcome or sit with feelings of overwhelm, that sense of, I'm in a wilderness, there's chaos around me, which I also think is suggested with that word Bamidbar.
Yeah, we think about it through the lens of journey. What does it look like to be on this journey that might hold both of those, that might hold kind of confronting isolation, might hold spaces of overwhelm, and all sorts of different pieces. There's this really awesome research that comes out of Harvard Center for the Developing Child that looks to the idea of resilience and what are the factors that help young people be resilient. And they define resilience as having like better than expected outcomes in the face of adversity. And they outline 4 core factors that we see as a like direct connection to journey through the wilderness and what happens through that process. And what we see in the Torah, in the book of Numbers, in terms of the Jewish people's kind of journey from Egypt. That research points first to what they call self-efficacy and perceived control. This idea that I have like the ability to affect change around me and that I am capable and competent. And we think about this through the lens of Moses at the Red Sea, the Jewish people at the Red Sea leaving Egypt. And there's this really beautiful story in the Talmud where like Moses steps up and is praying and like waiting for the Red Sea to part and nothing's happening. And the Egyptians are coming behind and chasing the Israelites. And they're like, what? You brought us out of Egypt to die in the desert? Like we could have just done that in Israel. And Nachshon ben Aminadav, this character in the Torah, kind of walks into the Red Sea and doesn't know exactly what's going to happen, but knows that like he can't stay where he is. He needs to move forward. And it's at that moment that the Red Sea parts. Nachshon is practicing self-efficacy. He believes that he has an ability to affect change and perceive control. The next piece that the Harvard research points to is adaptive skills and self-regulatory capacity. This idea of like, how do I get from point A to point B? How do I manage challenging emotions? And that's the next step in the journey through the wilderness in the Torah. It's like, how do we get water? How do I not hit a rock when I'm angry and expect water to come, but instead like work through the challenge and build skills to manage? The third piece is relationships. So we think about this through the lens of like Mount Sinai and peoplehood and what does it look like for the Jewish people to really like come together as a people. And the fourth factor that the Harvard research points to is like meaning, values, and purpose. And we think about this through the lens of like the Jews got to Mount Sinai and received the Torah, and then they still wandered the desert for 40 years. Like there was more work that needed to happen. And how do we find meaning like through that continued work? And so we think about time in the wilderness as this space to build skills, to build confidence and competence in yourself, to practice regulating challenging emotions in the face of different forms of adversity, like bad weather or a fire that won't start or whatever it might be, forming deep relationships and then finding meaning in that process. And so journey through the wilderness provides this really beautiful tapestry for us to go through each of those steps and support young people in strengthening all of those skills that help them like move through the challenges of life.
So how does this work like practically? Like, am I imagining that a kid comes and they're struggling with whatever they're struggling with and they kind of at some point absorb this Nachshon story that you told us about the man who walked into the Red Sea first and caused it to open up, and that's self-efficacy. And then this kid now has this story, and then later when they're experiencing something that's not demonstrating that, the therapist can say to them, try to practice being like Nachshon or something like that. Is that how this kind of thing works? Or is it more that these stories, this framework is what guides the therapeutic team, but it's not necessarily being directly shared with the kid?
Some individuals might really gain from like diving into a piece of text and exploring themselves and their experience through that. Others, that might not resonate. It might not be a part of kind of what the therapist brings to the experience. But we equip our therapists with understanding, like, what are these connections between mental health frameworks and Jewish tradition, and how can that wisdom be woven into the experience? I think that actually, like, some of the individuals who have really leaned into Jewish wisdom are actually those who have really contentious relationships with Judaism and might have a lot of family baggage associated with Judaism. And it might be something they really have wanted to push away from. And they find themselves all of a sudden being able to explore Judaism through a different lens and avenue without any sort of Jewish agenda. And all of a sudden it sparks a new interest because they can look at it from what they want, not what they perceive has been put on them previously. But we have really worked with individuals kind of across the Jewish spectrum, from totally disengaged and this is their first Jewish organized experience, to ultra-Orthodox and coming from a family where that is all they have ever known. It's all about finding the right pathway for the individual.
So I really want to sit again. I'm just in Torah mode today, I guess. That's not every day for me, but it's some days. 3.5 books out of 5 are in a wilderness. And we don't always think about that. We think about this story as okay, there's a group of people that sort of become a people, and then they journey to a place, the place being, the promised land. But what I find so important about the story, if you just look at the 5 books of the Torah, obviously there's the rest of the Bible, but if you just look at the 5 books of the Torah itself, you actually don't get to the place. You don't cross into the promised land. And so I really am appreciating what you said about how the framework of a journey is important for you. It's so cliche at this point that I'm hesitant to even say it, but some cliches are cliches because they're true. It's not about the destination in life or the solution necessarily for solving one's mental health. And you do some things and then you are just you're in promised land mode for the rest of your life. You've solved your issues. We're all of us in different ways, to moderate degrees, to more severe degrees, on that journey. And so part of me is asking, is that cool? Is that a wise choice of our text, right? To center things not on actually reaching the land. And yeah, look, somebody's going to email me oh, the book of Joshua comes later and then we go in the land. I know, but that's not the Torah. That's a less centered part of our tradition. So can you give us a little bit more of a sense of how you understand that journey? Because my sense is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that, look, I'm putting my own card to the table in my own mental health journeys with everything from seasonal affective disorder that I wrestle with in my life to other things. My goal is not to do some exercises, have some therapy lights, and be good. It's to know that that's a part of who I am and be on that journey constantly. So is that how you look at things? And might our Torah be sort of implicitly teaching us that?
I think the Torah is brilliant, honestly, for not ending with reaching Israel, but going back to the beginning. We get to the edge where the end is in sight, and then we circle back around and we start again. And I really love this idea in Jewish tradition of time as a spiral, that every year we kind of connect to the same holidays, the same kind of cycles of the Jewish calendar. But every year they're a little bit different because we are different. And so we're kind of constantly spiraling in that space. And I think similarly, thinking about both the Torah and mental health, it is an ongoing process. And I don't think in the mental health space you reach a destination, and who I am today will be different than who I am next year and who I am the following. But in each of those spaces, I have a mental health story to tell. And I am constantly kind of revisiting what supports me in finding wellness at different stages and places in life. And so we see this really beautiful thing in the Torah where this long, intense, challenging journey with different stages that happen, we don't get to the end of it. We return again to recognize that it is an ongoing process. We have deep tradition that explores all of those questions of meaning, values, purpose. Who am I? What am I doing in this world? What values drive me? How do they show up in my life? We have practices that can support us in coping with challenges. Think about grief and the journey of loss in Jewish tradition, and what a strong container that can provide for an individual through such a challenging time in life. And we have a tradition that draws deeply on relationship and connection and people. And we know that positive relationships, strong relationships, are one of the strongest mental health protective factors. So at Bamidbar, our perspective is that, like, how does Jewish wisdom inform our understanding of how we can help people strengthen mental health, build resilience, and find a strong path to well-being?
Okay, so I want to understand, what's the difference between wilderness therapy and Jewish wilderness therapy? And I think that another way to formulate the question is that I think that there could be three categories. We do Jewish, we are Jewish, and we are Jewish and do Jewish. Because I can imagine a world where we are Jewish and somebody who's not Jewish could come and have an amazing therapeutic experience with us, because what's driving us, it's like the Jewish is under the hood, and our team is being driven by all of this Jewish wisdom and Jewish concepts, but it doesn't necessarily have to be on the surface. And that can ultimately make a more powerful wilderness therapy experience than would be delivered by one that didn't have that chip inside. And there's another version that says, yeah, we have the chip inside, and at least in some cases, it's also very much on the outside. It's very much what the person is experiencing, not necessarily that they're sitting and studying a Jewish text. That might only appeal to certain people, as we've discussed, but that there are certain things that really make it to the surface, so that the person, when they leave our Bamidbar therapy experience after however long they're involved, they know that they've had a Jewish therapeutic experience. And I'm wondering which it is, how that manifests. Is it also, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But I mean, it would just be really helpful to understand all the possibilities even, and how that manifests for various kinds of different people.
We think about this through the lens of, what's the intersection between Jewish wisdom, mental health frameworks, and experiential education? It's those three pieces together. So I think it's important to step back. We've been talking a lot about therapy, and Bamidbar does more than just therapy. So we also offer community education programs where we're doing a lot of what we call like joyful Jewish mental health education. So how do we help connect the dots between, like, what's my understanding of mental health, my sense of personal resilience, and what's that connection to my Jewish identity? How do I look at the Jewish calendar and experience of different faces within the calendar, through the lens of supporting my mental health and resilience? So for example, the holiday of Sukkot, which is a harvest holiday in the fall, where we go outside and we build these structures and are supposed to sleep in them and live in them and eat in them. And we do this in the fall. Like, if you live in New England, it might be snowing and raining and windy and disgusting and gross out. And we call this holiday, we call this time Zaman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. And we ask this question at Bamidbar, like, what's the connection between making ourselves vulnerable, like going outside, and finding opportunities to rejoice? How do we connect the dots between spaces that introduce vulnerability and opportunities for connection and joy? And that might be a lens we bring to talking about mental health as a community. Someone in our program in that type of space might be walking away having had an experience where they're connecting to community and celebrating a holiday together in community, but also learning about themselves, learning about vulnerability, thinking about how this connects to their mental health, and connecting it to questions of, how do I find those opportunities for joy in the face of challenge and adversity? And also to think about, again, relationships and community are so important in terms of mental health protective factors. And so doing that within meaningful community in itself is supporting that mental health as well.
So I have a question that could be a little bit sensitive, and I don't want it to be taken as me like slamming rabbis. But I do want to say something because I myself am an ordained rabbi, and I think people have a misconception sometimes about rabbis, which is that we are trained as people that can really effectively at a top kind of level serve people and their mental health. It's not to say that we have no skills and that I can't sit with somebody who is struggling in some way and be there for them. I do think that I have some of that skill set, but I think sometimes there's a conflation made between clergy and therapists, and they're not the same. Part of what maybe somebody out there could be wondering is, and I'm not saying necessarily this is most of our listeners, but if anybody out there is wondering like, well, why do we need some separate organization to serve people's mental health? We have like rabbis, and I feel called to say that directly because every once in a while, people reach out to me in my rabbi role asking for me to serve them in ways that do feel like I'm not necessarily the right fit for. And I don't say like, go away, don't talk to me. I connect them to people. But I think it's important as like a communal intervention to have a moment where we delineate between like, what are the things that our clergy are actually really well positioned to do? And what are the things that they're not, which is part of why you need organizations like this with actual like trained therapists who can do other things?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So Bamidbar also does a lot of work training Jewish communal professionals. We work with about 2,000 educators, rabbis, youth serving professionals annually, supporting them and thinking about that question of like, what is my role? How do I appropriately support mental health and also recognize the boundaries of what I should be doing within this space? Part of how we teach this and talk about this in our programs is by breaking out kind of mental health and wellness into like two spectrums and talking about like what's our role within these two spectrums. So an old way to conceptualize mental health is like mental illness on one side of a spectrum and mental health and wellness on the other side of a spectrum. And we say, throw that idea out the window. Instead, we have a mental health spectrum and a wellness spectrum. And the mental health spectrum we think about through the lens of symptoms of mental illness. Do I have high symptoms of mental illness or low symptoms of mental illness? Why we think about it this way is to like normalize. Everyone falls somewhere on this mental health spectrum. I might experience depression. At some times those symptoms might be higher and I might have a diagnosable mental health disorder. At other times they might be lower, but kind of those symptoms of mental illness are all part of the human condition. Every person in our community falls somewhere on that spectrum. The role of Jewish professionals is to meet people where they are on that spectrum. It's not to move them. It is not the role of a rabbi to address suicidal ideation. It is not the role of a camp counselor to address depression. What we can do within Jewish organizations is create a container that allows us to include those people fully in Jewish life and to ensure that we are accommodating for those needs and recognizing the diversity of experience within our communities and creating space that can accommodate that whole spectrum. So if it's not our role to treat depression, what is the role of a Jewish professional? And that's where we get to that wellness spectrum. And we think about wellness, we pull from positive psychology, Dr. Martin Seligman's work, where he talks about this through the lens of like being in a space where you're flourishing or languishing. During the pandemic, there was a really popular New York Times article about this that was like, what's that blah you're feeling? It's called languishing. And this idea that like, I can be lonely, I can be isolated, I can be sad without necessarily having a diagnosable mental health disorder. That's languishing. And similarly, like I can have strong relationships and be motivated and engaged and like connect to community and struggle with anxiety and have anxiety. That those two things, when we're in a space where we're flourishing, we have more protective factors that support our mental health, and everyone can support people in getting to that place of flourishing. And similarly, when we're in a place of languishing, we have more risk factors that put us at kind of increased risk of mental illness. And so the role of a Jewish professional is to help people move from languishing to flourishing while creating an environment that can meet people where they are on that mental health spectrum. I think they speak to each other. I think they're definitely connected. that when we build those skills to flourish and thrive, that can help kind of pull us further on the mental health spectrum. But it's not like a direct, like I take one step in one direction and another, and my mental health moves too.
So I'm thinking on the scale of like the Jewish ecosystem and zooming out a little bit. It's like a different kind of question from the rabbi one, but it's similar. That was a question about like, okay, which niches do rabbis fill and which niches do therapists? Like, I'm imagining somebody out there listening that's like, they work for a JCC or they work for some kind of Jewish communal agency that works with all sorts of people. And I'm imagining a takeaway of like, oh, wow, our organization should have an office. We should have a staff member. We should have a few staff. I don't know. Like, we should have something within our apparatus that better serves mental health. That could be a takeaway. I'm neutral on whether that's a wonderful takeaway, a terrible takeaway, a neutral takeaway. I'm comparing it to what Bamidbar is closer to, which is it's interesting. You started as part of a broader Jewish institution, Ramah and the Rockies, and you became something that is standalone. And look, our podcast's bias historically has been that we really like things that start up independently and are able to shape themselves without being under some umbrella organization. And I think part of your success may be that you are doing this. And it's not that this is narrow. You mentioned you do therapy, you also do education, but you are not doing also a gym like a JCC would be, and also a Sunday school. Like, you are able to focus on this. And so I guess I'm curious, like, if there are people with those takeaways, what would be like the yes, amazing, like great takeaways? And what might be like, okay, good, you want your Jewish communities to better focus on mental health, but maybe don't jump to XYZ steps. I'm curious, like, what you would push us to lean into in our excitement and our energy, and what you would caution us against.
Yeah. We do a lot of work with organizations focused on the topic of like mental health capacity and how do we build mental health capacity within our organizations, and should we build mental health capacity within our organizations? And we think about this like through an equity and inclusion lens in a lot of ways, that so many young people are struggling with mental health. And if we're not equipped to recognize like when those challenges arise and have the right kind of container to allow folks to engage, then we're excluding a huge population from Jewish life. The young person who is struggling with mental health and gets kicked out of a Jewish summer camp because the camp can't kind of support them in that space. When we think about this, we look at this through the lens of like, what are the operational areas in our organization that help us build capacity? Do I have a referral list? Do I know where to go to like turn for help if someone in my community needs more resources than what I can provide? We think about professional development, like how do we train our staff around mental health? Who gets what sort of training based on their roles, and how does that help them stay in their lane? We think about like leadership. Does an organization's board understand the connection between serving youth and having mental health resources, and do they care about it and prioritize it? And so part of what I would say is that, yes, adding someone in your organization to have a mental health focused role, that can be a really powerful way if you know what your intention is. Like what role are you trying to play within your organization? And I would come back to those two spectrums and think about it through the lens of like, can we meet people where they are? Do we have the different like capacities in place within our organization to work with a diversity of individuals who come in with different experiences and needs? Leaning into mental health, having a social worker on staff, something like that doesn't necessarily mean that an organization is like stepping outside of the bounds of its mission. It's recognizing that we have a crisis on hand. Our young people are deeply impacted. And if we want to be able to provide services to young people, we need to like have thought internally about our capacities around mental health.
So I know that you have been thinking about the future of Bamidbar, and you've been changing, as we've talked about, the way that you've really been structured as de-emphasizing or stopping to do the residential element and moving into a more community-based approach. And I'm wondering if you could, A, describe what that future looks like and what you dream that it could look like. What would a future look like in 50 years from now if Bamidbar is as successful at bringing this paradigm to the world as you could possibly be? And then what is the growth edge on the Jewish content piece, the Jewish wisdom piece? How could it be even more part of what Bamidbar does?
So we, in 2023, moved away from residential therapy programming to a community-based model. And what that means is that we moved to providing outpatient mental health services rather than working with people in an immersive setting fully in the wilderness. And we did this because we wanted to bridge the gap between those young people who are struggling and their ecosystem of support. And so many of our values focus on the idea of community is so central to supporting our mental health. So what did it mean that we were doing this mental health work separate from community? So our vision in moving to a community-based model is this question of like, what does it look like and what does it mean to support mental health in community by community? And how we're doing that is by creating regional hubs where we are doing therapy, we are doing community education, and we are doing professional development for Jewish professionals all together. And the idea is to create like a community center focused on mental health that provides those direct clinical services, but also recognizes that young people don't live in a vacuum and we can't kind of transform the mental health crisis just through one-on-one care. We also need to strengthen that ecosystem around them. I'll give an example. Boston is where kind of all of these services are coming together in our first kind of hub city. And so in Boston, we run a fellowship for teens that educates teens around mental health and then amplifies teens like voices in community conversation around mental health. So the teens learn about mental health and then take on community projects focused on mental health awareness and destigmatization and put on this big community event where they're leading conversations about mental health. Simultaneously, we're partnering with the Jewish Family Service Agency to support caregivers and parents. And then we're working with a broad variety of organizations so that all of those professionals who work with youth have the skills to better support mental health, all while providing direct therapy. And the idea is that if this young person is getting the therapeutic care, but also their peers are talking about mental health and their parents have resources and support, and the professionals they engage with can recognize where they are, that person all of a sudden has this like really robust web around them that is bolstering their mental health in so many different spaces. And our vision is that like the Jewish community is really well networked. So we're actually really well situated to provide kind of holistic, integrative, community-based solutions to mental health that focus on prevention and education, on engaging families and caregivers, on educating the community and empowering youth kind of in their mental health experience and providing accessible pathways to care. That all of that can happen like really well in our community because we're so well networked. And it's this perfect space to kind of shift the paradigm on how do we support mental health.
A quick content warning here. This upcoming question contains discussion of suicidal ideation in my question, and then also in Jory's answer, she addresses that. So if that topic is not one that is going to be healthy for you to listen to, just fast forward this about 3 minutes and 15 seconds. I think you've hinted at this already. There are a lot of issues that we tend to treat exclusively as individualized mental health kinds of issues that we would better understand as both individualized mental health issues and societal issues. Because today, for example, if we wanted to effectively confront those who have suicidal ideation, one of the key ways to go about that would be fighting transphobia. Because we know today that trans youth they're among the groups of society that are most at risk for suicide. And so I wanted to open up a conversation as we arc towards the end about not just necessarily that issue in particular, but the ways in which these issues we treat as individual by individual. How does one person receive care for their, what's happening in their body, in their head, how it might actually tie to ways in which our society has fallen short, and how we need to balance pieces that focus on individual by individual mental health care and, societal interventions.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that mental health care is broken in America is that we oftentimes think about it through the lens of this like one-to-one interaction, this interaction between an individual and their therapist. Mental health is strongly connected to physical health, social health, economic health, occupational health, like all of these different pieces. Systemically marginalized and oppressed communities, the societal forces that are impacting them can have such a strong connection to mental health outcomes as well. A big piece of this, I think, is recognizing that this is complex and messy and a massive challenge that doesn't have one single solution. And that to support mental health and address the mental health crisis, we need to be thinking about ecosystem level change. What does it look like to combat transphobia and to address the critically high rates of suicide and depression and anxiety and mental health challenges in the LGBTQ plus community? How do we think about all of these different society level challenges that influence mental health while also working from the bottom up? And what does it look like to support individuals? What's the universal interventions that kind of can support everyone? What are the interventions for at-risk groups? What are the specific interventions for individuals? How can we think about those sorts of layers as we think about mental health? But also, how do we think about ecosystem to individual and individual to ecosystem, both directions?
So as we close, kind of open floor, I would love for our listeners out there, what's one nugget, because they're going to listen to this episode and certain pieces will stick with them, but what's one question they can sit with or one idea they can have? What's one or two somethings that as they go on to whatever's next in life, they can sit with around mental health and Judaism and the work that you're doing with Bamidbar?
I'll go with two nuggets. One, really deeply believe that Judaism has something to offer us in this space. That as we grapple with questions of why be Jewish? Why care? Why connect? There is so much wisdom we can pull from in this time of immense challenge and societal disruption and chaos in a lot of ways that can help give us strength in times of challenge. And so how do we see the relevancy of what Judaism, what 3,000 years of tradition has to give us as we think about this question of how do I live well today? That's one. And then two, what does it look like to build a community that is deeply thinking about the way that community can support mental health? Again, in Jewish community, we're so well networked and well positioned to build a different approach to supporting youth mental health, to building more services for the individual, but also having really robust opportunities for mental health education and resources that support flourishing and supporting educators and supporting that whole ecosystem to affect change, to create an environment that can robustly help young people thrive. Now is the time for us to do this. There's appetite, there's realization of how important it is for us to address youth mental health and questions about how do we leverage the strengths of our community to do that well. And so really see opportunity and want to ask folks to think about what does it look like for us to leverage our Jewish community to robustly support young people.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jory. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it and appreciate the opportunity.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder, Dan mentioned this at the top, but we've got Sean Harris's amazing 6-week experience in the Anya Shiva, Dungeons and Dragons and Dreidels that you can sign up for, you should sign up for, at judaismunbound.com/classes. Head there to learn more. We also, here's a little sneak preview, have some mini courses, some 3-week mini courses that will be starting in late November that we'll be announcing soon. So they're not there quite yet. But if you're listening to this episode a little bit after it was released, they might be up now. So a little time travel exercise there. But if you're listening on the day that it was released, not announced yet. But Sean Harris's class, judaismunbound.com/classes, head there. You don't want to miss it. And of course, we really, really love when all of you are in touch with us with any of your questions, thoughts, comments, ideas, visions, whatever you've got, you should send them our way because we love hearing from you. So here are the different ways that you can be in touch with us. There's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can check out the show notes for this episode, along with lots of other great resources. And of course, you can email us. Dan at judaismunbound.com or Lex at judaismunbound.com are our email addresses. We love hearing from you. So be in touch there. And we deeply appreciate, of course, if you're able to support us financially, which you can do via either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation at judaismunbound.com/donate. And the last thing I'll say is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.